So on the topic of modernism, I want to highlight some key moments in the 20th century reform of the Chinese language. Anyone who's tried learning Chinese knows one of the first things you learn is that the Chinese government somewhat recently converted its traditional character system to a more simplified version. From these characters you can see that in some cases there was a significant change, in others there was just a simple rearrangement, and a lot of characters didn't change at all. What isn't discussed until much later is whether this new system accounts for what makes Chinese modern. Anybody from Taiwan, or who still uses traditional characters like they do, would tell you that this change, which started in 1949, has almost nothing to do with the modernization of the language, because a much bigger transition happened about 30 years earlier with the May 4th movement. When we talk about Lu Xun's The True Story of A-Q, we usually credit it with being the first example of vernacular writing. When we call modern Chinese writing vernacular, we're saying it in contrast to classical writing, which some would even refer to as ancient writing. Prior to the May 4th movement, pretty much everything was written in this style, and that's exactly what made it so hard for common people to understand what was happening in writing. This bit about The True Story of A-Q being the first example of vernacular writing is a little misleading because Lu Xun actually published a few years earlier another piece that was written in the vernacular called A Madman's Diary. A Madman's Diary was just as progressive as The True Story of A-Q was, but it didn't gain as much traction and didn't become known for being the first example of vernacular. Regardless of which was actually the first instance of vernacular Chinese writing, we can't attribute the change in writing to be something that flowed out of classical as we could with traditional to simplified characters. It's much easier to attribute this huge change in the way that writing is done to be something that came from the outside world. This praise for A Madman's Diary doesn't take away from the significance of The True Story of A-Q, because The True Story of A-Q actually introduced another concept, the concept of the fiction novel. So it's actually at this point in history that we can consider the Chinese language to have transitioned into a more modern form. But it's not just because of Lu Xun. Plenty of Lu Xun's contemporaries would go on to use the vernacular and the novel to write about things like government, education, ethics, and even further language reform. So in a way, you could actually say that the reform that happened in 1949 was a product of modernization rather than a cause of it.